We begin our study of the 1916 Rising by looking at the key leaders, the 7 signatories of the 1916 Proclamation, that iconic document of Irish independence. And the first signature on that document was of Thomas J. Clarke, 58 years old at the time of the rebellion, and seen as the godfather of the revolution, an inspirational figure who had continued with the struggle for Irish independence despite years of ill health, years of imprisonment, and years of just pain and suffering. He had been born in Dungannon but forced to leave Ireland in 1880 because he was wanted in connection to a riot. But in 1883, he set out for England on one of those bombing missions that the IRB was involved with in those decades, to strike fear and terror into the hearts of the British. But in London, he was caught carrying a suspiciously large black bag, and he was arrested. And they discovered explosives. He was arrested, charged, and sentenced to life imprisonment, penal servitude for life. And the prison conditions were appalling. One of his friends, a man called Gallagher, went insane. The prisoners were regularly woken up in the middle of the night, their sleep patterns disrupted, they were deprived of food, sometimes they were beaten. It was horrific. But Clarke kept his sanity, and even when he was released 15 years later, after an extensive amnesty campaign to secure his release, he decided he would continue the struggle. Physically, he was a changed man. He was stooped, broken down, physically a much weaker man. His face had aged prematurely. He looked 30 years older than he actually was. And he returned to America, where he set up a new newspaper, the Gaelic American. And that would be one of the key newspapers, one of the key outlets for Irish nationalist thought in the years ahead. But in 1907, he decided to return to Ireland, and he bought a tobacconist shop in Dublin on Amiens Street. And to all intents and purposes, he was a nice, retired, elderly man, selling cigarettes, selling newspapers, and taking it easy. But really, he was behind the scenes one of the key figures in the revolutionary struggle, the man who persuaded Patrick Pearse to speak at O'Donovan Ross's graveside in 1915, and the man who all the other leaders turned to sign the proclamation in 1916, because they realised that without Clarke, without his example, there would never have been a rising. But if he was the inspiration behind the whole thing, then, and if Pearse was the chief actor, the person on stage, then the person who acted as a kind of a stage manager or producer was a man called Sean McDermott, or Sean McDermott, because he was Clarke's right-hand man. He was a key figure in the IRB, he acted as secretary, and he spent much of his time travelling around the countryside, often on his bicycle, recruiting members, infiltrating other organisations like the Gaelic League, like the Gaelic Athletic Association, and finding members there who might support the nationalist cause. And he then became a key organiser of the practicalities of the rebellion. But he knew, being a realist, that it would not succeed. He wrote in 1915 that all it would be was a national protest. He said, "We'll hold Dublin for a week, but we'll save Ireland." The third person is perhaps the most extraordinary. He was the person entrusted with designing the military plan. His name was Joseph Mary Plunkett, and he was only 29 years old at the time of the Rising. You might think, because he was given that job, that he had a lot of military experience, that he had served in the army. He had no military experience. The only experience he had of soldiers was playing toy soldiers in his bedroom with his older brother. He was a quite eccentric figure, flamboyant. He loved wearing bangles and extensive jewellery, rings on his fingers. He carried a sabre around his belt, as well as a German automatic machine gun. He loved standing out from the crowd. And he designed the plan for the rebellion. And sometimes people looked at him in the GPO and they said, who is this guy? I don't know whether to laugh or to cry. Why is he dressed like that? And James Connolly said, I don't care how he dresses. I trust him. He's a good guy. But I think that shows a certain naivety on Connolly's part, because the plan was fatally flawed. It believed that all you had to do was seize key strategic positions in Dublin, the General Post Office on what is now O'Connell Street, the GPO, Boland's Mill, Jacob's Biscuit Factory, the South Dublin Union, and other spots. And they actually believed, and here they were supported by Connolly, that the British state, being capitalists, would not open fire on property. They would not destroy these buildings. And so they believed they would have a chance. And that was incredibly naive. What was even worse was that Plunkett decided not to capture the key strategic locations, including Trinity College Dublin. There were arms and ammunition in Trinity because there was an officers' training corps unit there. And if they had seized them, well, they would have been very well equipped. Also, the walls of Trinity were perfectly suited for a defensive campaign. Plus, you could have snipers along the walls, and then you'd have a viewpoint of all of the key streets. But they didn't seize that, and they didn't seize the House of Lords opposite. And partly that was because they believed, just in case the British did decide to shell these buildings, then it would be a national catastrophe for Ireland to lose these historic sites. And so they didn't. And it's interesting to see that afterwards, during the rebellion, General Maxwell, he located his base of operations in Trinity and used all of those vantage points to control the areas around. And it's interesting to speculate about what might have happened if the rebels had seized Trinity. Would Maxwell have shelled that historic university? And the answer is, we just don't know. The next leader of the rebellion, well, he was one of the, I suppose he is one of the least well known. He was a man called Edward Kent. And he was 34 years old at the time of the rebellion. And he was a founder of the Irish Volunteers. That's why they chose him to be one of the signatories. He was also a musician. He played the pipes in front of the Pope, Pope Pius IX, in 1908. He had travelled with a group of Irish athletes and musicians. And he was someone who was a very religious man. During the fighting, he would stop during a lull and he would lead his men in a saying of the Rosary. He would get them to join in prayer. The next leader was Thomas MacDonagh, 38 at the time of the Rising, and a teacher and a playwright. And what's interesting about him is that he joined the Gaelic League to make fun of it. He thought it was a ridiculous idea that you would meet to discuss the Irish language, Irish poetry, Irish literature. And he thought the people who did it were idiots. So he went along to make fun of them and disrupt the meeting. But as soon as he was there, he was entranced. It opened his eyes. And from that point on, he was a revolutionary. He was a teacher at Patrick Pearse's school at St. Enda's and also became a university professor where he taught English literature. But although his lectures were occasionally entertaining, they were never relevant. His former students said later that although they had fun in his lectures, it was never on the advertised subject, and he just seemed to go from one topic to the other. The sixth signatory was James Connolly, 48 at the time of the Rising, and really one of the key figures. The person who actually did have some military experience because at the age of 14, he had joined the British Army under an assumed name. He did it for economic reasons, but he learned an awful lot about fighting there. He had been born in Edinburgh in Scotland because his family had been forced to emigrate after the famine. And at the age of 21, he deserted the British Army because it was about to send him off to India. And he didn't want to fight in India, he wanted to get married, and so he deserted and went off to the United States, where he became a leading socialist. He was involved in the foundation of the Industrial Workers of the World, and returned to Ireland after 7 years of being an insurance salesman in upstate New York with a committed worldview that believed in socialist rights and egalitarianism. And he was involved in the 1913 lockout. He set up the Irish Citizens' Army and was brought into the plans for the rebellion because he had begun saying that he would lead his men out in a rebellion. And the IRB were afraid that this premature uprising would alert the British. And so they effectively kidnapped him. They brought him along to a meeting, and for 3 days they negotiated with him. And they said, we would like you to join our struggle. It'll be the volunteers, the IRB and the Irish Citizen Army. And after 3 days he agreed, and he then became a key figure in it. And he did it because he believed that you must first win Irish independence and establish a free and equal Irish state, because otherwise you would never achieve the kind of free society that he believed in. So he believed that this was a necessary first step before he could see the realisation of the dreams and the hopes that he had for Ireland. Patrick Pearse, the last of our 7 leaders, is the most controversial of all of them. He was 36 at the time of the Rising, and he was someone who believed that this would be a national protest that would rally the Irish people, that this was following in the footsteps of Robert Emmet. Indeed, he is alleged to have exclaimed towards the end of the fighting, well, at least we lasted longer than Emmet. Emmet only lasted 2 hours in his insurrection. We have lasted almost a whole week. Dublin will become a glorious city. It'll be as glorious as Paris. Pearse was a dreamer. Pearse was a romantic. He had none of Connolly's practical instincts. And he was someone who believed that, well, this was a way of restoring Irish pride. This was a way of restoring Irish dignity. He had been a school teacher. His school was noted for its educational innovation. And some of his schoolboys at St. Enda's joined him in the GPO. And in the letters that he would write to his mother from the battleground, he would say, the boys are doing well. My students, they're okay. And Pearse was someone who believed that one man could free a people, just as Jesus had. And he believed that he was that person. He could be that rebel. William Irwin Thompson wrote a brilliant book called The Imagination of an Insurrection. And in it he said that while the role of the rebel is very general, the way in which the role appears in the imagination of one man is very particular. And you see that very clearly in the role that Pearse had in 1916. He was to be the symbolic leader. Although they gave a title to Connolly, that Connolly would kind of have practical command of the forces, they gave the overall commander-in-chief title to Pearse. Not because they expected him to be a good strategist or leader, but because he was the person that they gravitated to because of his charisma, and they wanted to maximise all of that. To give an example of his power, he gave a speech to the volunteers a few months before the rebellion, where he paused, where he said nothing for an entire minute before he began speaking. There was absolute silence as the men just stared at him, wondering what Pearse would say. And finally, he looked at them and he said, I know that you have been preparing your bodies for the great struggle that lies before us. But have you also been preparing your souls? But the men didn't laugh. The men didn't think this was a ridiculous thing to say. The intensity with which he said it, the fervour, the passion, carried them along. And they nodded in agreement and said, yes, we will be ready. We will be ready for this great struggle. And so as the proclamation was prepared and as the men marched out on Easter Monday 1916 for the fight of their lives, they were coordinated by a group of 7 men, all of different backgrounds, all of different beliefs, but who shared one great ambition. 1916 Rising and everything else failed. Within a few weeks they would all be dead, but the legacy would live on forever.